Great. Well, welcome, Hal Harvey. Good to see you again. Thanks for making the time to talk with me about your new book, which I have here, The Big Fix, 7 Practical Steps to Save the Planet, that you wrote with Justin Gillis. And I know our audience at Generation 180 is going to be really excited to hear from you because we're all about inspiring and equipping everyday people to get engaged on clean energy. So this book was really exciting for us to read. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here, and I really appreciate the chance for this conversation.
Great. Well, why don't how could you share a little bit about your background? Because I think it's so interesting. And tell us a little bit about why you came to the decision to write this book and why now?
Sure thing. I'm an engineer by training with degrees both in civil and mechanical engineering. And I got involved in the energy business actually when I turned 18 because I was obligated to go register for the draft because Jimmy Carter reinstated it in order to build the so-called rapid deployment force in the Mideast, which was aimed at protecting American interests against foreign oil producers or terror or whatever. And so that put a pretty sharp focus on the question of oil and oil imports.
Yeah.
What I was doing at the time was home construction, solar homes with my brother. And we came to realize that it was not very complicated or difficult to build a solar heated home. And this is, I hate to say it, but more than 40 years ago. So we built the solar homes. And so to have this dissonance on the one hand between getting ready to go to war, not so long after the Vietnam War wound up in its tragic way, and on the other hand, having readily available technologies to save energy. And this was at the time when cars got an average of 13 miles per gallon. So we weren't just importing oil, we were wasting it in just copious quantities. We still are.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that is so interesting. And in this book, when I was reading it, how it felt like almost a call out for like a revitalization or renewal of civic engagement in a way, because you talk a lot about citizens flexing their muscle, about exercising influence, and finding these levers, and sometimes secret levers because people don't know about them. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you have 7 steps, but can you talk about the few that you think are most important for just everyday people who aren't engaged on this issue to know about?
So this is the right question, because what motivated us to write the book is to identify the places where citizen intervention makes a big difference. I mean, the normal reaction to a political issue that you care about is to write a letter to your congressman or congressperson. That turns out not to be the most effective thing to do. It's always fine. Civic engagement is wonderful in many flavors and shapes. But if you know who makes the decision that most affects the planet, then you can make a strategy for changing that decision. And that's what the book's all about. When you send in your utility bill at the end of the month, your $70 or 114 bucks or whatever it is to your utility, does that money land on green choices or dirty choices? Who decides whether your money goes to solar and wind or coal and natural gas? And the answer is the Public Utilities Commission of your state. So how many people have gone and stood before the Public Utilities Commission and said, hey, let's get this straight. We need to wind down. We need to quit cooking the earth. And how hard is that? And how complicated is it? And who did it? And what happened? So we tell this book not only identifying those levers to power, but telling stories about how people got involved and pulled those levers and made a big difference.
Yeah, you say how many public commissioners are there? I think you had a stat in the book that I find fascinating.
Just over 200. So roughly 5 per state. Some states have only 3. And these people control 40% of the carbon in the economy.
That's amazing.
It's a big number, those 200 people. And they're obligated to listen to you. They're called public utilities commissions because they're supposed to serve the public. So they have hearings.
Yeah.
And you can come in and you can stand in front of them and make your point. Now, a lot of the conversation is a sort of a regulatory patois between utility lawyers and PUC lawyers. And that requires lots of specialized knowledge. That's kind of full-time job business. But let's say you live downwind of a big coal-fired power plant and your kid has asthma. You know what? you need to do something about that coal-fired power plant, and they're obligated to listen to you and bring your kid in and let them understand what it's like to be a mom, to have a kid who can't breathe, and that it's on them for that, and therefore it's on them to change. And I don't mean, one last point,
Yeah.
this is all a narrative of opportunity. You know, the climate change picture is pretty horrifying if you study it closely. My suggestion is people should study it enough to get concerned, but then flip to the solutions as fast as possible, because that's ennobling. It's energizing as well. And when you focus on solutions, your strategy becomes much more pointed than just raising awareness. It turns into, how do I save this planet? How do we keep it from just burning right up?
And I love this story because, part of, I think, the problem with energy and people getting engaged on it is that it feels complicated and it feels like it should be left to the experts, right? So what do I know about building codes, or what do I know about utility? And when you make it more personal and talk about our collective future, then I feel more empowered to go talk about it. But I do feel like there's barriers around this kind of expertise that you need to have or feel comfortable speaking out.
Well, it's good to have some logic. And I would recommend a couple days study before working to intervene in one of these decisions or decision-making venues. It's also a great idea to look and see who else is doing this work in your region and see if you can piggyback some help onto them. But as I say, every good argument has ethos, logos, and pathos. So ethos is your ethical standing. Every single National Academy of Sciences in the world has argued for rapid action on climate change. You don't have to be that scientist, but it's totally legitimate to point out that they all saying it. There's your ethic, there's your ethos.
Right.
Your logos. It's now cheaper to build a solar farm from scratch than to just pay the operating costs of a coal-fired power plant.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Again, you don't have to fight every detail there. And pathos, how does it make you feel when your kid has asthma or when there's soot on your windowsill at the end of every single day? So take those elements, put them in human terms and present them. It turns out that's a very hard combination to defeat.
Love that. That's very empowering. And how do you, things have changed recently over the past month or two, right?
Yes.
The Biden-Harris administration's efforts and the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's a huge climate bill. How does that kind of change the equation for you in terms of the recommendations that are in this book?
So we wrote the book before that all happened, of course. Right. So the question is, do those recommendations survive? And it turns out they not only survive, they thrive.
Exactly.
So we argued for rapid decarbonization of the electric grid by switching from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act just made that even easier because economics is now a tailwind instead of a headwind.
Yeah.
So across the board, I think it accelerates and emphasizes the conclusions that are in the book or the suggestions in the book. We've reached an interesting point in the energy economy of the world. So it's now cheaper, I often say, to save the world than to destroy it. But while we've won much of the economics game, we have not won the battles between the status quo actors and the newbies. So if you own coal mines, you're going to want to dig coal, and you're going to want to sell it at the highest price possible, and you want to try to get the volume up to the highest price possible. So add in the oil companies, the natural gas companies, with their mighty lobbyists, their economic power. It's now a race against incumbency, not against technology, not against price, but against incumbency.
Yeah. And speaking of the Inflation Reduction Act and the other bills that have been passed, it seems to me what's not being talked about as much is that there needs to be like an equally historic investment in communications and outreach, right? Because these efforts, people don't know about the tax incentives. If those cash incentives aren't used, then we don't get to where we need to go. What do you think about that angle or that aspect of what needs to happen?
Well, it's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And it's getting better. I mean, most people understand that there are electric cars. More and more people can understand how to get those electric car rebates, which make it cheaper and cheaper to get an electric car.
Right.
The smallest segment, of course, is wondering how they're going to get plugged in, right? Do you have to rewire your house? What if you live in an apartment and so forth? So there are some genuinely confusing elements here. But if we don't wake people up to the solutions, both as green consumers, i.e. buying that electric car, but also green citizens, and by that I mean making sure that the chargers are put in place, making sure that school buses are electric, making sure that dump trucks and delivery trucks are electric. We need to build a revolution in inches amongst people, but in miles amongst systems. And they go together. They reinforce each other pretty beautifully.
That's great. In the book, you have some stories about Republican politicians who are supportive of clean energy in their states. And I think one of the things that's frustrating is knowing that actually renewable energy is popular across the ideological spectrum.
Yep.
And most Americans don't realize that. In fact, we just saw a survey the other day that most Americans have this kind of false social reality because they think that less than 40% of Americans support climate action, which is just wrong, like over 70%. So there's actually it's actually a more popular issue than people realize. But you have these politicians that you mentioned that are doing well in terms of supporting clean energy at the state level, but not at the federal level, nor are they still acknowledging that there's a climate crisis or a climate emergency. How do you deal with that disconnect in terms of us going forward?
Well, to some extent, the waters have been purposefully poisoned by people who resist change.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the Koch brothers, who have made close to hundreds, or maybe now hundreds of billions of dollars in the oil and gas business, and then you look at their political contributions, the answer becomes sort of glaringly obvious in some cases. But we also have some responsibility ourselves to think about civic action and how to overcome this. So it's not always very productive, and it's often counterproductive to talk about climate change instead of clean energy, because the numbers for clean energy are even higher than for climate change, regardless of the fact that they're the same thing.
Right.
And then to talk in economic terms about the solutions rather than moral terms about the problems. So the state with the most wind energy, Texas.
Yeah.
Just behind Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Right. There's a governor's clean energy, governor's wind energy coalition, and it's got as many R's as D's on it. So start where people are, conform to their interests, bring in local examples, and identify those secret levels of power. Who decides? There's still incumbency out there. There's still powerful economic interests that will fight this.
Yeah.
We can win that battle. We can't win it by being too precious. We have to be practical about these conversations.
I hear that. And then in your book, there is a chapter about that. I love the name of it. I think it's Inventing Tomorrow. Yes. Around innovation, which is great. Is there a particular innovation that you're most excited about?
Well, I'm most excited about the innovations that have made it to commercial reality, because they offer so much for us. But we argue in the book, and we use it as a thread that hooks everything together, that there are these learning curves, that prices drop as volumes increase. And there's a number of learning curves that are really fascinating and wonderful, and that are showing up in the Inventing Tomorrow section of the book. So for example, low-cost electrolyzers combined with solar can turn ordinary water into hydrogen. And hydrogen has many uses, for example, creating fertilizer, which obviously the world needs. Creating fertilizer is a very dirty, energy-intensive business today. It could be a clean one tomorrow with cheap electrolyzers plugged into cheap hydrogen, or into cheap solar cells to make hydrogen, I should say. So that's one realm. Batteries, the innovation is nowhere near done. You know, lithium-ion batteries are about twice as good as a battery from 10 years ago, and they cost about half as much. That's a lot of progress in 10 years. But what about the next 10 and the 10 after that? Can we get past rare earth minerals, cobalt, nickel, and so forth? Can we move to solid-state batteries that last 1,000,000 miles instead of 200,000 miles? Can we get to more energy dense systems that might make short haul aviation cost competitive, short haul electric aviation cost competitive? Some of my favorite innovations are very mundane. So California's energy use for buildings has dropped 80% since the
Wow.
first California Energy Code was adopted. And it turns out that there are these invisible but and incredibly thin coatings on windows that turn them into heaters in the winter and air conditioners in the summer. Passive cooling, the Greeks knew about this, the Anasazians knew about this. We forgot. We just built boxes and put air conditioners on top,
Yeah.
which is a little insane. So I guess adding a little bit of elegance to solutions, a little bit of elegance in design and technology is a whole nother realm that I love.
Yeah, I like that. And I thought it was really interesting at the end of your book that you added a chapter around religion. That was a surprise to me. I didn't expect it, and I thought it was really interesting. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why you added that, and then maybe a little bit more broadly about what role you think culture needs to play in terms of speeding up this transition.
There's a great moral question hanging over all of this, which is, do we have the right as citizens of today to leave behind burnt offerings for citizens of tomorrow? Do we have the right to destroy the topsoil, to alter the weather patterns, to extinguish life in the oceans, to oversee a great extinction crisis, to let mighty forests burn, to flood out entire towns? More than half of Pakistan was underwater this year in terms of the population. So I don't think we have that right. I don't think we have the right to cheat future generations for our near term. And I don't think we have to. We have to make some hard choices to avoid doing that. So from my perspective, it's an ethical question, not a religious one. I'm not a religious person. But I hope I'm an ethical person. Try on a good day. And that's where the question arises. What is our obligation? It's interesting. One wouldn't do it to one's own children. At least I hope not. There's those cute little bumper stickers. I'm spending my children's inheritance on the back of RVs. Right. Well, that's not a good idea for your family.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea for the planet.
Yeah, agree. And from a broader cultural perspective, what do you feel needs to happen on that front? It feels like a real shift needs to take place in terms of this speeding up at the rate that we need it to.
We need to, first of all, be optimistic about the future and push solutions rather than harp on problems. A little bit of problem goes a long way. Solutions are self-reinforcing. Problems peak and then go down. And I had a friend who once said, optimism is a social change strategy. And he's right.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we have to do is pull up your socks, as they say in England, and go get something done. And look what we did in World War II. There's a book by Tom Friedman called That Used to Be Us. Well, America did great things.
Yeah.
What great things are we up to these days? Why can't this be one of them? Why can't this be a primary one? And then this gets to the question of spreading it through society and who resists. And I keep talking about status quo actors. But I've seen some corporate epiphanies. So Ørsted is the Danish wind company that used to be the Danish oil company. A number of oil companies are turning, they're good at building things, big, complicated machinery offshore. They used to do it for oil rigs, and now they're doing it for wind turbines. So what are the transformational opportunities, and who are the transformational actors? There's a steel mill in Sweden that's run on hydrogen, and they're using it to build Volvo cars. So that's pretty good. I sure hope they're electric cars. I think they are.
Right.
So you have to get into the physical economy to affect climate change. It's not something you do with bits and bytes. And people love that. There's an excerpt of the book that Justin and I wrote in Popular Science magazine. That made me so happy.
Yes.
Right? Like, get it out of Foreign Affairs or the Washington Post and
Yeah.
get it into popular science, popular mechanics.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's part of the challenge, right? Like, how do we make building codes, heat pumps, public utility commissions sexy, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you get people thinking about these issues, right? It's not an easy thing, but I think there's ways to do that. And starting with the solutions and the optimism and reaching people in different ways, I think is really,
Yep.
really important. So I'm glad to hear that you feel optimistic and that we are up to the task. If there is one kind of takeaway that you would want to leave people with, what is that?
There's a lot you can do. It seems like a big intractable problem, but there are opportunities in every corner. In order to find those opportunities, you have to know something, not a lot, but something about the energy system in which decisions are the most critical, and who makes those decisions, and how you can intervene in those decisions. So it takes a couple days of homework. It pays to look for groups that are similarly strategic in your region,
Mm-hmm.
and then jump in without fear, right? If we have an ethical duty to pursue a great opportunity to quit poisoning our children, let's do that.
Yeah, and take advantage of this opportunity of innovation and economic gain as well, right?
Yes, exactly. It's
So,
all right there in front of us.
yeah, agree. Well, Hal, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And we'll be putting out more information about your book over the next few weeks.